Hey, how's it going? It's Lee Halliday, and today we're going to be looking at 3 different ways to fetch data in Next.js using the 3 new hooks that they introduced with 9.3, getServerSideProps, getStaticPaths, and getStaticProps. And it all came about when I saw this interesting tweet from Adam Wathan. Next.js 9.3, very exciting. Who needs GraphQL when you can write SQL? And what he shows is basically a way to directly grab data from your database and then provide that data to your component via its props. And this brought me back to PHP days 10, 15 years ago. Also, I write a lot of Ruby on Rails, so it's very similar to sort of server-side rendering concepts. Highly recommend checking out this Full Stack Radio episode that Adam runs, where he interviews Tim Nootkins, who's the lead maintainer and developer on Next.js. They talk about all these things. And specifically, as I mentioned, we're going to be looking at the different hooks that they introduced in this latest version. But specifically, we're going to be looking at 3 different ways you can grab data for your pages in Next.js. So let's pop over to this very basic Next.js application I have running. It's already up and running with now.dev, so it's running locally there. And if I pull up my repository, I'll give a little bit of a tour of what we're working with. So Next.js, all of your pages go in the pages folder. I right now have a companies page with a dynamic ID, so a dynamic portion in the path. And that's why I'm able to do jobs 1 or jobs 2. Right now I'm just showing job for all of them, but or companies 1, for example, companies 1, etc. So dynamic sections of the path. So I've got a page for each company. I've got a page for each job. I've got a home page, which is right now, we won't be looking at this, but it's displaying the jobs I have in my database. So if I go there, I can see we got a Rails developer at GitHub. These are fake jobs, I made them up. But they're all coming from a local Postgres database that I set up. 2 tables. It's got a jobs table with 4 random jobs I created, and it's got a companies table with 4 random companies. One thing to note, not all the companies are featured, and that will be important that we'll get to later. Okay, so back to the code. I have already set up this page. So my job component, job page, which is returning right now this div job. So we're going to be looking at one of the newest props that they introduced called getServerSideProps. So in previous versions of Next.js, they had getInitialProps. And quite honestly, I always found this a little bit confusing because it could run either on your server or on your client, depending if it's the first request or if it's subsequent requests triggered from the client side. So you always had to write isomorphic code. All that means is basically any code you write needs to be prepared to run in any environment. So it got tricky, like when you're dealing with secrets, you don't want to expose them to the client. Even something as simple as fetch. You had to use like a node fetch or an isomorphic fetch because you weren't sure what environment you were running in. Or cookies, how do you grab cookies? It differs depending where you are. So they introduced a new function that you can export, and it will be an async function. And it is called getServerSideProps. Just like that. So getServerSideProps will always run on the server no matter what. You don't have to worry about any keys or anything that you use in here or any libraries that you import. It's all going to be tree shaken so that it doesn't bloat your client code. But the goal of this function, as you saw in Adam's demo, is basically to return props that will be passed into your component here. So let's get started at that. What do we have available to us? In here, we have the params. So what are params? In our case, if we go to jobs 1, the params in our case will be this ID here. And because our file name is named with brackets, that means this part is dynamic. So we're going to be receiving the ID as one of its params. And the goal here will basically to be returning props that get passed into our job component. So we do that by returning an object that has a props object. Cool. So if we wanted to look at the params, for example, to see what we're receiving, I can just refresh this page, pop into the console, and here you can see we're receiving the ID. So we're going to use that to query directly to our database. I've already set up a connection to Next, which is a query builder. It basically allows you to execute SQL. So I'll just show you what that looks like. That's in SRC So I'm creating a Next connection and exporting it here. I've got this death package I've been playing around with. When you deploy this code to a serverless environment, if you get traffic, it's always spinning up new serverless functions, and it can overload your connections to like cheap hosted databases. So I was trying to sort of kill them off as soon as the serverless functions are killed. But this is besides the point. So I'm able to import this connection to the database, and we'll just come in here and we'll query the job that we want. So const job equals await, because it's an async. So DB will select star from the jobs table where the ID matches the one that came in via the params. And we want the first one because it's just finding one job, right? So just like that, now I can look at the data, make sure I got it right. So console.log that job out. Come here. Here I can see that it found the job for company 1, Rails developer. So I can pass that job into this component, and that will allow me to receive this here, the job, and I could come into this div and I could do something like, let's put an H1 here, and we'll put the job.title into the H1. So there we go, Rails developer, go to 2, React developer, 3, payments, Rails developer. So we have our jobs pages rendering. The way it works is when you load the page, it will basically run this code on the server, and the result of that will be passed to your component, which will be run on the client in the browser. So why don't we just grab the company as well? So company is await DB select star from companies where the ID matches the job.company ID, and we want the first. So now we can pass in the company as well, which means we can receive it here in the component, and we could put that it's a, say, a Rails developer at company.name. Just like that. There we go. So payments, Rails developer at Shopify, Rails developer at GitHub. So one other thing you have available to you here is the Node HTTP response object. Say the user requests a page that doesn't exist, or you want to redirect them elsewhere, for example. So we'll just say if it couldn't find a job with that ID, we will, redirects are sort of weird in this, but you basically write the HTTP status code along with the location you want to send the user to. We end the response, and then we can just return to get out of this function so that it doesn't keep trying to run this code down here. So now say if I only have like 4 or 5 jobs, so I'll do 7, it just redirects me back to the home page. But if I go to one where it finds it, oh, 1 doesn't exist, jobs 1. There we go, Rails developer at GitHub. So use this technique anytime you want to sort of, without fear, grab data server side. It doesn't need to be from the database. It could be from another GraphQL API or REST API. It could be from the file system. It could be from MongoDB. It could be from anywhere. And you don't have to worry about it loading like Next in the client. Next.js takes care of all of that for you. And this will execute every request on the server side. The next type of data fetching and two additional functions or hooks that Next.js introduced are to build static pages. So static pages are built at build time. So basically when you deploy your next code to say to the Zeit serverless platform that they have, it will build all these pages at build time when you deploy. And then whenever a user visits your site, it will serve up cached versions of those pages. So they'll be lightning quick. And there's two functions you want to work with in this case. The first function is export an async function that is called getStaticPaths. Cool. So what you do with this function is you basically return an array of all of the pages that should be generated. So we're going to generate a page for each one of the featured companies. So these three here, GitHub, Shopify, and where I work at FlipGive. So Twitter is another company in here. It's not featured though, so we won't build a page for it. But I'll show you how you can sort of lazy load that page via fallback. So as soon as someone visits Twitter, it will be generated dynamically and it will be cached from that point forward. So what you want to do is again, grab your connection to the database. We are going to be fetching the companies from the database. So const companies equals await db.select star from companies where featured is true. And if you wanted, you could limit it. If you want, it's up to you. You could order them and grab the first 50 or whatever. So what you want to do here is return two things. Well, an object that has paths. So this will be an array of the pages to statically generate. And whether or not to allow for fallback pages or not. So if you're going to create every page possible, you can say fallback false. But if you wanted to lazy create something like Twitter, you can do fallback true. Cool. So I'm going to build the paths. So what I'm going to do is map the companies. So each company. And for each company, I will return props. And in this case, I'm only going to be giving the ID. So company.id. So if you wanted to, you could just select ID here to make it a little bit more efficient. And you could even come in here and you could say, I want just the ID. And then you could clean this up and just pass the ID. And now the code is really nice and clean. So what we want to do now that we have an array, because we mapped them, of objects with props, we will pass the props in here. So we can just do that. And that part of it is done. So where do these paths go? You have to use this hand in hand with another function that they created. So export async function getStaticProps. So this function will receive, it will be called once for every path that this function returned. So once per company. And you have access to the props. So we will come in here and we'll grab the props. And, sorry, I'm a liar. It's not props, it's params. My bad. You receive params. Okay, sorry if that confused you. Each path contains the params that are passed to getStaticProps. So what we can do with the params now, we're receiving each company's ID, is we can load the company from the database. So const company equals await db.select star from companies where ID is params.id, and we'll grab the first one. And then very much like getServerSideProps, your job is to return the props that will be passed to the component when it renders. So here we can return an object with props and we'll pass the company as props. Cool. So because we've generated a path for each of our companies, this getStaticProps has been called once per company. So we could even see that by console.logging company. Now that said, I don't think it actually runs that when you're developing locally. It will only sort of generate these on demand as needed. But if you were to build this and deploy it, this would be called once per company. So scratch that. But now we have our company as a prop that we can use up here. So company. And we can say jobs at, let's do this as an H1, jobs at company.name, like that. So now, there we go. If I go to companies 1, okay, a required parameter ID was not provided as a string. Okay, I know what this is. This means, I think what we have to do is, the database gives us this ID as an integer, but I think all of these props have to be strings, I believe. So what we will do, I think that was that. A required parameter ID was, yeah. So what we can just do is say ID is ID dot toString. There we go. So it has to be a string because normally those params come via the URL, this part of the path, and they all come as strings. So it wants them all as strings. So now we've got jobs at GitHub, jobs at Shopify, etc. So when we deploy this, it will create pages for the 3 featured jobs. But then if you were to request Twitter, which is ID 4, that's not like an ID 4. Oh, for some reason, cannot read name of undefined. So let's see what we're receiving. Console.log params. For some reason, it's not liking that. Let's restart this. Maybe that's the issue for some reason. No, doesn't like that. I did say fallback true, which is weird. I don't know. Let's keep going with this. Ah, I know, I figured it out. Okay. So, when you're dealing with fallbacks, you have to handle it a little bit as a special case. Because the first time the user requests it, it has to go to the server, generate this page and get a response back, and then render it out. So, what you do in that situation, all of this code was fine actually. The issue was that we have to put a check in to see if it's still loading the fallback or if it already has got the data yet. So what we can do is access the router via the useRouter function. And then what we can do is check if the router is equal to isFallback. So if that's true, we can return loading job like that. So basically this component will be called twice. Once in its loading state and a second time in its when it has data. Let's see if that works. Now Twitter works. And you can see for a second it says loading job. And then we've got jobs at Twitter. Cool, figured it out. Oh boy. So what I wanted to show was a third way. We've basically covered 2 ways now of grabbing data. One which is server-side, sort of on demand, every request. Another one which is finding static paths at build time and then building each of those pages statically with an optional fallback. But I want to show how you could basically combine static pages with loading additional data client side in the browser. So I've installed this library SWR from the same folks at Zeit, and it is used for basically data fetching in a hook client side in React. So what I'm going to do is create another component called jobs, and I'm going to pass in the ID of the company that I'm trying to load jobs for. So we'll come down here below and we'll create that functional component. I'm going to put it in the same file. Maybe you'd have a components folder out here, but just for demo purposes, it's going to be right here. So function jobs, it will receive the ID of the company, and then our goal is to go to the back end and grab those, but client side. So what we are going to do is use SWR. I've got a fully separate video on this, so I'm not going to go into how it works. I'll link to that video below. So what we can do is we can say const data and maybe loading is equal to useSWR. And the way useSWR works is you have to pass in a key. So in our case, we're going to be giving the path that we want to request in the backend. So I created a path to grab jobs for a specific company. So this is a JSON endpoint. I'm not going to go into this code, but it's basically fetching jobs from the database and returning them as JSON. We can see that in action if we open up a new tab and we say API jobs for company 1. We get all the jobs for that company. So that's what we're going to be fetching the data from. Cool. So it is API jobs for a specific company, which is the one being passed to this component. And you need a fetcher function with useSWR. So it's this one that will receive this path, and it will use fetch to go and grab that from the backend. So what we can do here is, let's just say if not data or loading, let's just return null. We won't render anything at all. If we get to this point, we know we have data. So what we can do is we can return a UL where we map all of the jobs. So data is actually the jobs. So why don't we give it a proper name here? Jobs. We'll map them. So for each job, we're going to create a list item with a key of its ID. And in here, we will just put the job title. So job.title, like that. Cool. So I don't think Twitter has any jobs, but if we go to the first one here at GitHub, it's not liking it for some reason, so let's troubleshoot. Internal server error. All right, what is happening? Cannot find module API jobs. I have been having this issue with Next.js and now, so I'm just going to stop the server. I'm just going to clear out the next folder and restart, and hopefully it will just fix itself. It's probably because I've been like deleting and resetting code as I've been building this and then demoing it. Now if I load the page, there we go. Change nothing and somehow it works. Wicked. So if I go to company 2, it loads this part statically, and then client side it goes and it grabs the jobs for this company. So what you can do is you can build static pages that have some content, and then when the user visits them, you can client side using useSWR or React query, go and fetch additional data. And we can see here If we go to the network and we look at the jobs endpoint, we can see that it's making that request and it's getting back the JSON data as a response. Cool. So that's what I wanted to show today. And you can see I can link into, say, Shopify, loads the static page, and then that's there. That's what I wanted to show today. Basically, the 3 new hooks or functions that were introduced with Next 9.3. So what we covered again were getServerSideProps, run server side. You can do some pretty cool stuff like just going right to the database and returning props that get passed into your component. We also looked at 2 functions here, getStaticPaths to basically return all of the pages. So in this, you can imagine reading a whole bunch of markdown files, loading it from the database like I did, making an API call to a WordPress site, making an API call to another CMS. It's totally up to you what you do with it. You can build them all at build time, or you can just build a few of them. If you have 1,000 pages, you might not want to pre-build all of them. So you build the important ones, like the featured ones, like I did, and then you fall back for all the other ones, which get cached and then get all the benefits of static builds after that. So this function gets called once per path or per page. Given the params, you can load whatever data you want and then return that would be passed to your page, your component. We also showed how to handle the fallback that screwed me up for a few minutes, but basically to handle the loading state. And then we created a little jobs component that will, after page load client side, using the useSWR hook and fetch, go back to your server or wherever you're loading data from. Could be GraphQL, could be whatever. Grab the data and then you can render that client side that will be fetched on every page load. That's what we covered today. I love Next.js and I love these new hooks functions that they've added. I much prefer them over getInitialProps because I built a website and I was loading cookies and it was always a battle, like, am I in the browser or am I in the server? This way you always know where you are and it's a lot more straightforward in my opinion. Hope you enjoyed the video. Take care. Bye.